ever struggled with a worst case scenario mindset? Thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. I am so glad you are here. My name is Danielle Zapchenk. I'm your host, and joining me today is my friend Rachel Nafzinger. She discusses her journey of vulnerability, healing, and the miraculous moments that have shaped her life.
For some of us, life is done to convince us that it would be better to just curse God and die, but yet we still hold on. And for those people, I would say that even if they feel like they have only a tiny sliver of hope, they probably have much more hope than they realize.
Here's my conversation with Rachel Nafzinger. Thrilled to introduce you to my friend Rachel. Rachel and I, we met, I'd say like a year or two ago through our friend Kelly Olson. So Rachel, thank you for being courageous, sharing your story, and jumping here on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share my story.
So Rachel, you live in South Carolina. One of my favorite things is to find the local spots. If I ever came to your area where you live, I'm the type of person that I keep everything in Google. So if you told me that your favorite restaurant where you live, I would save it in my phone so that someday, in case I should be traveling through, I know exactly where to go. So tell me, if I visit you today, where would we go in South Carolina?
Well, it's interesting because I have a lot of food allergies. Okay. So I can't eat out a whole lot, but I will say, before I was allergic to everything, I loved there is a creperie. I don't know if you've ever had crepes.
Yes.
But Tandem Creperie in Travelers Rest, South Carolina is just a really cute, quaint little place. There's a bike trail that leads up to it, so you can bike up and have a crepe, and it's just a really cool vibe.
So we are about to jump into summer. What do you and your family like to do in the summer? Are you usually we're just going to rest, or you said biking? So do you guys go on bike trails? What do you about?
My kids are still learning to ride bikes, so I'm hopeful that will be a new thing we do this summer. But we like to go to lakes, in the mountains, hiking. I'm not really a beach person. I grew up near the beach, and so I think to me, the beach is just kind of normal.
Yeah.
So mountains to me are really spectacular. So we like to try to spend a lot of time up in the mountains.
If you could visit any place, maybe some place you've already been to and you just really love, or you're this is on my bucket list, where would that be?
I love Yellowstone National Park.
Okay.
I got to go there on a vacation with my family when I was in college. And that was just the most spectacular vacation I've been on. Just so beautiful.
When you think of a national park, or if I even think of a local forest, I can see the general vicinity of how big it is. I didn't realize how large Yellowstone was. And definitely.
It's several states. Yeah. It covers several states. Not the whole state, but It goes into several states. Yeah.
Pretty wide. All right. Well, so tell us a little bit about your family. What are you passionate about? What do you do day to day?
Yeah. So I am married to my incredible husband. Been married for 10 years. We have 2 beautiful, energetic kids. In August of this past year, I quit my job and started a new adventure and am homeschooling. So it really has been an adventure. I don't regret it, but I will say it's been challenging. And I'm really passionate about stories. More specifically, how we can encounter God and experience healing through writing and sharing our stories. And I'm really blessed to partner with an organization called the Baton Pass. And I know you've had some people from the Baton Pass share, and that's kind of how we got connected.
Yeah.
But for those that don't know, the Baton Pass exists to empower women to overcome through the sharing of their stories.
Yeah.
And I really love getting to help with that organization.
How did you even get connected to
That's
Kelly
a great
or
story.
how did that happen?
So A friend of mine, Davey Blackburn, was a youth pastor at my church. And so he started a podcast called the Nothing is Wasted podcast. And I listened to it periodically. And Kelly was on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. And I happened to listen to that episode. And for whatever reason, God just really stirred my heart. And I'd never done it before, but at the end, she gave out her email address. And I remember I was walking around a lake when I was listening, and I just got my phone out and wrote her an email and was like, hey, I just really like what you do, and, you know, maybe we can talk sometime. And I was shocked. Like that same day, she emailed me back and was like, hey, let's jump on a Zoom call. And I was like, what?
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
That's how we got connected. And it's been an amazing journey. So yeah.
I love to hear stories like that where maybe it's not your personality to write an email to someone that you don't know. But yeah, like there's something about like God that maybe you feel excited or you feel encouraged or you're like, yeah, I have to do this. And when we listen to that, it can just be so cool. And so it's now like, see, like 2+ years later, you've been really instrumental. And I love that you talked about like the stories. I mean, obviously that's like the whole premise of this podcast is that stories matter and that we want to encounter Jesus. So before we get into your story, Rachel, I do have one more question. If you look back at the last year or two of your life, especially now that you've conquered homeschooling, what do you feel like you have grown in? And that could be in any area.
I tell you, I've really grown in vulnerability because going through hard things and hard times, just being honest that you're struggling with something. That's something that I feel like I've grown a lot in this past year.
Once you hear Rachel's story, I think that'll totally connect. And I'm so proud of you for sharing because, you know, this takes a lot of courage to just be like, sure, I'm going to say my story. And also I think for you do care about the story and like how it sounds. You want to clearly communicate how God is encountered. And so I appreciate that about you. So Rachel, why don't you go ahead and jump in and share your story with us?
Before I get into the story, I wanted to start with a quote that is really meaningful to me. It's by C.S. Lewis, and it says, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us. We are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." And I don't know about you, Danielle, but I really resonate with this. I really do believe that God has great things for me. But at the same time, I also know that the road to those great things can be filled with pain. And really my first encounter with pain was when I was 5 and my older sister was diagnosed with a rare bone cancer. And I didn't really understand how bad it was, but I watched as her hair fell out and she became really frail and she was in the hospital a lot. I remember feeling really sad because I could tell that she was in a lot of pain. My parents are really strong Christians, so I remember praying for God to heal my sister, but she died just before her 10th birthday. It's hard to face something like that really at any age, but I was only 7 when she died. Later in life, I had to work through some really adult-sized emotions and questions. And I wondered why God didn't heal her. I wondered why my sister had to be the one who got sick instead of me. Just a lot of questions about why things happened the way that they did. As I grew up, my sister's death affected the way that I viewed life. In my mind, the worst case scenario was not only possible, it was also probable. So you couldn't say to me, oh, that'll never happen, because I knew that it could happen, and it did happen. And I remember one time I was in high school and I found this painful lump and I was convinced it was cancer. I was probably 16 at the time. And I was going to a summer basketball camp, and I remember just being at the camp playing and thinking, no one has any idea that I'm dying from cancer right now.
Oh my gosh.
It was in fact not cancer, but that is just how my brain worked. I loved God and I believed in his goodness, but I knew that pain was also a reality.
You had talked about your worst case scenario. You were like losing hope. And so if you had the worst case scenario, you felt it was not only possible, it was probable. How do you encourage somebody to kind of move out of that mindset?
This is something that I am still working on. It's really hard to kind of retrain your brain after you've experienced the worst case scenario firsthand. One thing that is helping me is understanding that my thoughts are just thoughts. They're not reality. So my brain jumps to the worst case scenario because it's trying to protect me.
Yeah.
It senses that there could be danger and it wants me to be prepared. The trouble is that if I dwell on those thoughts, they are no longer helpful. They're just crippling me with anxiety. So I've really been working on thanking my brain for trying to keep me safe, but then taking a step back and trying to see what is actually the more likely scenario.
Yeah.
Another thing I do is I try to write out my anxious thoughts. If my therapist is listening to this, she knows I email her my anxious thoughts.
Okay.
Then the next day, I'm always like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I was so worried about that. But it helps to retrain my brain that like these things that I'm worried about or I think are going to happen, like they don't usually happen.
Yes.
From a spiritual viewpoint, God says to cast our cares on Him. Yeah. And so it's also incredibly important to be having a conversation with God whenever we feel those worst case scenario thoughts kind of welling up inside of us. I have a friend who has something called a God box, and she will write down things she's worried about and then physically put them inside the God box to symbolize giving it to God. And I think that's just such a great, tangible way to get those worst case scenario thoughts out of your head, and while also surrendering them to God.
Absolutely. It's like training a muscle. And if you are an adult and you have been doing this all your life, you're right. It is a constant retraining, and it's easy to fall back into because we're human, right? So thank you for that.
It's probably not surprising that my sister's death has made it hard for me to hope. I believe that God can perform miracles, but I know from experience that even if you have all the faith in the world, it doesn't mean He will perform. And since there's no way to know which requests God will grant on this side of eternity, sometimes I just rather not get my hopes up. And at some point, I think I was in college, I decided it was better to just pray for God's will instead of what I actually wanted. At the time, it felt like, like I was this mature Christian praying my spiritual prayers. But really, praying for God's will is supposed to be done as an act of surrender. And it comes after you've laid your request before Him from a place of vulnerability. But when I prayed for God's will to be done, I wasn't actually surrendering my will. I was choosing not to have a will so that I wouldn't be disappointed. And I remember even cringing a little bit on the inside when people prayed for miracles, because I felt like I wanted to warn them not to get their hopes up, not because God couldn't do it, but because there was a chance that He might not. They had the best intentions, but sometimes I felt like maybe they were just being naive. In April of 2015, my husband and I were hit by a drunk driver. Both cars were totaled, so we felt very fortunate to have walked away from the accident with what we thought were minor injuries. But as time went on, I just started having these really strange symptoms. My feet would get really painfully hot, especially if I wore socks or shoes. I went to doctor after doctor and had test after test, but they all told me that they couldn't find anything wrong with me. After more than a year with no answers, I was finally diagnosed with a rare neurovascular chronic pain disorder called erythromelalgia. And at the time, it was a relief to have a name for what was wrong with me, but the future didn't really look bright. There's no cure for erythromelalgia, and the few treatment options they have don't often have very good results. So it was definitely discouraging. I know that a lot of people were praying for me during this time, but I'm kind of embarrassed to say that I didn't pray much for myself. I knew it was possible that I'd never be healed, and I just kind of accepted it. If God wanted to heal me, great, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. Each year on April 19th, which is the anniversary of the car accident, I felt a rush of emotions and questions. The whole thing just didn't really make sense to me. I felt like I could do so much more for God if I was well. Before the car accident, I had found purpose in mentoring the students at my church, but I could no longer do that because of the pain. So one day I decided to confront God, and I wrote him this letter. Dear God, I am angry. I feel like I have no hope. Do you want your glory now? Is that what this is for? You can have it, but I don't want this anymore. I'm not strong enough for this. If your goal was to break me into a million pieces, it worked. I'm done. It's all so meaningless. I'm sick of making excuses for you. I'm so alone. I just can't see the good. And this was really the first time that I let down my walls and was completely honest with God about the pain that I was experiencing. And then I sat down at the kitchen table with my journal open and my pen in hand, ready to listen for God's reply. And he spoke this into my heart. He said, Dear child, it doesn't seem possible right now, but this won't be forever. Newness is coming. Just don't give up on me or yourself. Ask me for big things and wait. I'm not rejoicing in your sorrow. I weep with you. Cling to me. Cling to truth. Fight for hope. And when you don't feel like you can take it anymore, look up. I will be with you through it all. The broken pieces will become a beautiful mosaic in time. Just walk with me. And in that moment, God was so near to me. My vulnerability had opened the door for him to come close. A couple months after this breakthrough, I found out that I was pregnant, and my husband and I were so excited, but we were also a little nervous because we didn't really know what to expect. You know, I braced myself for the worst case scenario, but there was no way for me to really even comprehend how bad it was going to get. The burning pain in my feet became constant, and the only way I could dull the pain was by putting my feet in ice water. And eventually I couldn't take my feet out of the ice water and had to stop working. I went days without sleeping, and the skin on my feet began to ulcerate and to split open from the swelling. And I remember one time when the pain was just unbearable, and I knew I would be alone all night and not able to sleep. And I just begged God for relief. I let down my walls. I was completely vulnerable with him. And that night I experienced two very different realities at the same time. It's hard to explain, but I felt both completely alone and wholly sustained by God. It was like holding agony in one hand and peace in the other. A few days later, I was hospitalized with sepsis, which is a life-threatening infection in your bloodstream. But while I was in the hospital, my husband and I started talking about names for the baby. We didn't know if it was a boy or a girl yet, but we thought we'd just look up the meanings of names that we liked. I said, I've always really liked the name Josiah, but I don't know what it means. So my husband looked it up, and he said it means Jehovah has healed. And it seemed like the perfect name given my situation. But I still had just one reservation. I didn't want my kid to have a really popular name. So I told my husband to look up the popularity of the name Josiah. So he found it ranked number 55. So that was great news. But then he said, you won't believe this, but the girl's name with the same ranking is Lucy, which is our daughter's name. Wow. So the two names were listed side by side like they belong. belong together. And at that point, it was settled. We not only knew we were having a boy, but that his name was supposed to be Josiah. Just for fun, we decided to look up the name David on the popularity list because it's my husband's middle name and the middle name that we had talked about using if we had a boy. And David was ranked number 12, which was the same ranking as the girl's name Grace, which is our daughter's middle name. Yeah.
So crazy.
And so in that moment, I forgot all about my pain and I marveled at God's goodness. I knew that God saw me. He saw my son. And in the midst of so many unanswered questions, he was right there with us in that hospital room. I spent the rest of my pregnancy in bed with fans on my feet, listening to podcasts, reading books on lament, and they were like a healing balm for my soul and really taught me how to hope again. So I was really hopeful that my symptoms would improve after Josiah was born, but unfortunately they didn't. I was overwhelmed and disappointed. My mental health declined and I was diagnosed with postpartum depression. But here's where the twist comes. The antidepressant that I started taking made my feet improve dramatically. I wasn't all the way better, but it was still a miracle. And I could drive again. I could go grocery shopping. I could go to church without a wheelchair. It just felt incredible. I remember one of the first things I did was I took my son, who was probably about 9 months at this time. We went over to Lowe's. I bought a gallon of paint and we went back and I started painting his nursery in our new house because it was something that, you know, as a mom, you just want to do, but you don't often get the chance. So I also remember asking Lucy, my 3-year-old daughter, if she wanted to play outside with me. And she said, "Mommy, have you ever been outside?" Which just made me well up with tears because I knew that it was opening a whole new world for me to be able to enjoy life with my kids again. And this is where I would end the story. It would be the kind of story I grew up hearing in church, the ones where God performs a miracle and everyone says, "Wow, isn't God good?" And that's the story I would want to tell, but it's not the end of my story.
Yeah.
The truth is that even though I improved physically, I continued to decline mentally. And it was kind of like the reprieve from the physical pain allowed all of the emotional pain to come flooding in. And I was just overwhelmed. At the time, my feelings didn't make sense. Here I was finally doing so much better on the outside, but I was drowning on the inside. I started having suicidal thoughts, but I didn't tell my family or my friends, and I allowed shame to isolate me. One day I had this thought: if nothing is wasted and God can redeem anything, then he can tell a beautiful story out of the ashes of my suicide. And that was really my wake-up call. I knew that I needed help, and I finally decided to let other people in and to accept their help. Over the next year, I would feel really great for a while, only to get really depressed again. I cycled through ups and downs every few months or weeks. I was confused because my mood often did not match my circumstances. I was reading my Bible one morning, mainly to check it off my list, if I'm being honest. And God called my attention to a verse that I hadn't noticed when I initially read it. It was Deuteronomy 11:11. God was telling the Israelites about how the promised land they were going to be entering was different from the land of Egypt. And he said to them, "Rather, the land you will soon take over is a land of hills and valleys with plenty of rain." And later that day, I was diagnosed with type 2 bipolar disorder. I truly believe that God gave me Deuteronomy 11:11 as a promise that even though I was entering a land of hills and valleys, of ups and downs, that he was promising to send plenty of rain to sustain me. Most often, God sends his rain in the form of his presence and his peace. Other times it's in the form of a friend or a loved one. And sometimes it's even a nap. Whatever his rain looks like, it's enough to sustain me.
You also mentioned how you didn't want to pray much. And I think sometimes we don't want to share that with people, that like either we don't want to pray, we don't feel like it's helpful to us in a certain season of our life. So what do you do or not do to kind of help you through that season? Do you just not pray? Do you ask for help in that vulnerable state? What's your answer to that?
I think that is a really good question. One thing I try not to do is beat myself up about it. I don't really think that's God's heart for me. Instead, I try to dig a little deeper to figure out why I don't want to pray for myself. Is there a lie that I'm believing that's getting in the way? Or am I just really walking through like a desert season where I'm so depleted that I just don't have much to give? I'm really blessed to have some prayer warriors in my life who I lean on when it's hard to pray for myself. So for me, my Christian community is really, really important. I also find that listening to like reflective, worshipful music is helpful, because even if I can't find the words or energy to pray for myself, just listening to others talk to God through songs can sort of connect my heart to God, even if I'm not the one singing. And I'd love to share a playlist of some of the songs that are helpful for me.
That'd be awesome.
We could maybe put it in the show notes.
Absolutely. Yes, super cool. I think just as being a Christian, and I've shared this before to others, that I think we have this idea of what prayer is, that it's like, it's only this, or that's what we've been taught as kids. So you just assume like, well, that's what everybody does. And I really feel like prayer has, I'm still not like the best at it, but there's like so many different facets to it. Really been introduced to breath prayer in the last couple of years, of just like saying one word, because like maybe that's all you can say. And just the concept of just breathing in and out. And you're right, listening to worship music, or just like being, or just knowing like, I'm here, God, and this is all I can do right now.
Sometimes I love going into nature because I feel really connected to God when I'm surrounded by like his beautiful creation.
I love that your parable story, Rachel, taught you how to hope again. Like that word came up over and over. I'm thinking I'm definitely going to use that for the title of this episode. But why do you think hope can sometimes feel so far away from us? And I know you've experienced a lot of trauma, a lot of loss. But why is it like we feel like we're just trying to grab onto it over and over again?
I think sometimes we have this kind of all or nothing mentality when it comes to hope. I used to think that someone either has hope or they don't have hope. But I think the truth is that we all have some degree of hope, or we wouldn't get up in the morning otherwise. And I think that sometimes hope feels far away because it doesn't come as naturally or as easily for us as it does for some other people. For some of us, life has done everything to convince us that it would be better to just curse God and die, but yet we still hold on. And for those people, I would say that even if they feel like they have only a tiny sliver of hope, they probably have much more hope than they realize, because even in the face of so much adversity, they still keep going. On April 19th, 2022, the 7th anniversary of the car accident, I happened to drive through the intersection where the accident happened, and I internally braced myself for the flood of emotions that typically comes, but instead I felt peace. And The next night I was putting my daughter to bed and she said, Mom, after Dad put me to bed last night, I prayed and asked Jesus to come into my heart. I was so excited for her. And then I realized the significance of the day. The day before was April 19th. April 19th, a day that used to symbolize death to me, now symbolizes life. But I want to be very careful about the way I finish this story. It's true that God sustains me and that He is redeeming the painful things from my past. But it is also true that sometimes I still have a hard time seeing the good in my story. And I often feel alone in my day-to-day struggles. So sharing my story today has honestly been probably more for me than for anyone else. And if, I'm sure some other people can connect with that. And it brings me to the final thing I want to talk about, and that is the importance of being vulnerable. There is power in sharing your story, the good and the bad parts, in safe places and with safe people. It helps you heal and grow. So I would challenge anyone listening to really consider sharing your story, maybe with just one person or maybe with a group. But regardless of whether or not you get to share your story with others, make sure that you're allowing yourself space to be vulnerable with God. My prayers have changed a lot over the years. I'm definitely still a work in progress, but I've come a long way from only praying for God's will. What I can say with certainty is that praying vulnerable prayers opens the door for God to meet with us and speak to us. I know that some days God may still feel far away, but He is never actually absent. And personally, on those days when He feels distant, I'm going to listen to this podcast episode so that I can remember His faithfulness. As I wrap up my parable story, I want to thank you, Danielle, for this opportunity. I am so glad that God connected us and that you never gave up on me. You kept inviting me to come on the podcast, and I kept turning you down because of my own insecurities. But you are a gift to me and to so many others.
Thank you.
And so I just want to thank you for creating this safe space for stories to be shared and for hearts like mine to be healed.
You're so welcome. Oh, that's going to make me cry. When you said it's like hard to see the good, gosh, I feel that for you and for like so many people. And I think that is so relatable because we want to see the good, but like when we're suffering, when we see other people suffer, it's just hard. So I think that is so authentic to say like, hey, the story is not always going to be wrapped up in a bow. Maybe parts of it are, but we're not going to know the full piece. And I think that's so lovely. I'd love to know, what was your sister's name?
Rebecca.
It's beautiful to still like honor like Rebecca's story as well. Yes, she lived till 10, but I mean, her impact on your life still lives on. And so when you said in your part of your story, like you needed to still deal with those adult sized emotions that you had as a child, like how did you know? Like obviously you said the physical got like kind of turned off for the moment, but all of a sudden these emotions started coming up. How did you know that you needed to deal with that? Because you said you also didn't want to share that with anybody.
I didn't even realize that I hadn't dealt with my sister's death until I went to college. I didn't know anyone. So, as you're getting to know people, there's the usual questions. And so they would say, do you have any brothers or sisters? And I would kind of casually say, well, I had a sister, but she died. And their jaws would just drop and they would say they were so sorry for me. And it made me realize that, wow, this is really actually a pretty big deal. And I've been minimizing it for years. Yeah. So I did a lot of writing and journaling to get those emotions out and to really like work through those questions that I had. And so, yeah, I didn't really actually grieve her death until I was in college.
And also, sometimes I wonder, I mean, the type of understanding of grief lament mental health from when you were a child. Like, also when somebody experiences something like that, nobody is like, oh, here's the exact steps you need to follow in order to grieve, and then figure out how do you communicate that to kids as well. So I think there's so many people that have had traumatic events, that big T or little t trauma, and you don't realize it until after. And so sometimes my encouragement to anyone listening that is like, why am I feeling like sad? Like, today's a pretty good day. I would try to like unpack that as best as you can. And if you can't do it by yourself within prayer, like definitely just go seek some counsel, a safe friend, a therapist to walk through, hey, maybe there's something underneath that is there. The last piece that you had mentioned was on vulnerability. I think that is definitely a process of like growing into something. Tell me more about how that has changed your relationship with God and others. And I know you kind of unpacked that a little bit, but how you've seen, did you even say, like, wasn't that what you said earlier? Like, that's what you grew in this year. Is that what you said?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of unpack that a little bit for me.
You know, vulnerability really has changed my life. As I have opened myself up to God and to others, I've just seen how it opens the door for me to be able to receive love and healing and so many other things. And I will say that you don't need to open yourself up to everyone, you know, but ask God to give you the discernment to know when it's the right time and person. And you will find that as you open up about your struggles, it also frees them up to do the same.
Yeah.
And as far as my relationship with God, I would say that vulnerability is still something I'm adjusting to, but I find that writing my prayers is really helpful. I'm also reminded of the book by C.S. Lewis called Till We Have Faces. It's fiction and it uses Greek mythology, but it is everything that C.S. Lewis writes. There are spiritual truths woven into it. And near the end of one of the characters who's been kind of questioning the gods and blaming them for her troubles and complaining that they don't answer her, she sort of has this revelation where she says, and I'm paraphrasing, but she's like, I know why it is that the gods don't really openly speak with us until we are really honest with them. Why should they listen to like our babbling? How can they meet with us face to face until we have faces?
Yeah.
And that part of the book has really transformed the way I think about my relationship with God. I can't truly know God and he can't reveal himself to me unless I'm being my true self with him first.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think vulnerability, it breeds intimacy, which can be scary, you know, and that's in any relationship, whether that is for friends of like, kind of like what you were saying back with college, like when you said like, oh, my sister died, like, are we going to have like a full on conversation or is it just kind of like, oh, I'm so sorry. So like, where is that level of trust and growth happening? And the same goes for our relationship with God. If we're not ready, we can only receive so much just because that's just where our heart is at that point. Okay. I do have one more question and I didn't put this in the show notes, so don't be surprised, but I will. I am curious. Do your kids know about Rebecca? Like, how do you share about her? Or is that something that you're like, I'm just not ready to do?
We do talk about her, not like every day or, you know, all the time, but we'll talk about how they would have had an Aunt Rebecca and they have cousins on my husband's side of the family. But because I only had that one sister, they don't have any cousins on my side. Yeah. But they're still, you know, like they'll ask questions about, you know, well, will you see Rebecca? Will we see Aunt Rebecca in heaven? And, you know, will we recognize her? And I'll tell them, yeah, I think you'll recognize her. And I think she'll know who you are. But part of, you know, what I've wrestled with is that I was so young that I don't have a whole lot of memories. Yeah. So I have to kind of live off of the memories of other people. So.
Gosh, it's so beautiful to think, as painful as it is while we walk through here on this earth, like on the other side, like Like that you just get to have that family forever, like with her. Like that's really beautiful. Oh, I'm sorry I'm cried more than you, Rachel. I am really grateful for your story. And just like, just the honesty, because I think like people, they need to hear the hard truth of what life is like. Yeah. And so I'm grateful that you have written this out and shared this so beautifully. And thank you for helping us encounter God in a new way. So if you want to connect with Rachel, I'll put her email in the show notes. We'll put that playlist in there. But Rachel, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you so much, Danielle. This is the best yes I've made this year.
I'm so glad. Thank you. What I appreciate about the honesty of Rachel's story is that everything is not all tied up into a bow. Just like each of us, our journey continues and we don't know what is up ahead. But just like Rachel said, we can hold on to God's promises in the midst of the hills and valleys. If you are struggling with your mental health, you are maybe overwhelmed, or you just need a safe voice in your life to walk you through this season or possibly past trauma, I highly suggest and encourage therapy or counseling. Just like this podcast is my way of sharing my gifts, this is an opportunity for licensed counselors and therapists to use theirs to help you. To connect with Rachel or to listen to her playlist that she made for us, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Rachel. Number 1. Are you living in a worst case scenario mindset right now? I'd love for you to choose to surrender, just like Rachel did, so that you can release those unhealthy thoughts. Number 2, in what ways can you step out into vulnerability this week and share something with another trusted person? One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass this episode along today, it really helps people know that they are not alone and everybody has a parable story. Also, a huge shout out to my talented husband, Eric, for his editing expertise. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how his safe spaces can heal our hearts. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.